Hello, FGs and Cs. My name is TVSkine, and I was working on another video, a very different video, but then Riot just had to go and drop an honest-to-God 3.5 minutes of actual Project L gameplay footage, and now that's pretty much all my brain can actually think about, so I guess we're doing this now. Project L is the still untitled fighting game that Riot is working on, set in the League of Legends universe in a project that is helmed by apparently some very solid names in fighting games. I don't know much about fighting games. The last fighting game I played regularly was Marvel vs. Capcom 2 on my friend's PlayStation using an original PS1 controller, and I was bad at it, but what I do know is character design and animation, so that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to look at the animation of the footage that's been shown off in the Project L teaser. We're going to look at the interesting changes that the game has made to the character designs of the champions that we see, and I'm gonna nerd out about 2D effects that are animated on 1s and 2s, you know, the usual stuff. Before we do that though, two things. Number one, I cannot stress it enough that the footage that we're about to look at is unfinished. I'm going to be pointing out many of the ways in which it is unfinished and talking about why it looks awkward and scuffed, alongside talking about things that look really fun and cool about the gameplay footage. But I don't want anyone's takeaway from this video to be that Project L looks bad, or that it has bad production values, or that the developers are lazy or cutting corners, or whatever. When the game comes out, I will be first in line to give Riot shit for any problems that it might have, but right now, even though in motion a lot of the gameplay looks slick and cool, it is obviously very unfinished. It's a work in progress, and for the moment, I want all of us to cut the game a break for that. Let's not judge it the same way that we would a fully finished and released product. That's thing number one. Thing number two is, this video is sponsored by Skillshare. And if you've been around on YouTube, you've probably heard of them at least once already. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes for people who want to explore their own creativity. If there's something you want to learn how to do, odds are pretty good that Skillshare can help. And if you sign up with the link in the description, you'll get a full month of access for free. Skillshare offers video series on self-organizing and prioritizing, including taking care of your mental health while trying to get work done. With a subscription, the classes are ad-free, with new premium classes launching every week, which are fully subtitled in Spanish, Portuguese, French, and German. And hey, since we're talking about art and rendering today, why not check out Digital Painting: How to Color a Character Like a Pro by Stephanie Berm. Berm is an artist in the games industry and takes you through a full step-by-step process of coloring and rendering a character to a high standard, including learning about light sources and ambient and occlusion shadows. You can find that and thousands of other inspiring classes on Skillshare, and the first 1,000 people who use the link in my description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. And with that out of the way, welcome to the actual video. This is a little bit of an old school video for me, which is to say, it's not heavily scripted, it's mostly me putting stuff on screen and talking about it. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna start with some of the effects animations that Riot showed off in the trailer. We're gonna talk about how those are constructed, because it gives me the opportunity to talk about my favorite subject in animation, which is animating at different frame rates. Yay! Then we're gonna move on to some of the concept art that they posted of Illaoi, talk a little bit about her character design and how it's changed relative to the way that she looks in-game, and even perhaps in the Ruined King game, although she's not much different from that. And then, after that, we're gonna get into the actual gameplay footage that Riot showed, and we're gonna talk about all of this glorious effects animation, and we're gonna talk about some of the many, many ways it still looks very scuffed and unfinished. And I know I reminded you of it very sternly in the intro, but I'm gonna remind you again. All of this is work in progress, it's very unfinished, and I'm gonna try and be generous to the developers who worked on this and not try and make it sound like this is bad work, just pointing out the ways in which it is unfinished work. Anyway, let's start with some effects animations, and this is in 60 frames per second, which is lovely. It gives me more frames to work with, but also makes it a little bit harder to count out the frames because there's twice as many of them. But if you've been along to one of my animation breakdowns before, what you've probably heard me talk about more than once is the concept of animating at different frame rates. So, if you animate something at the full frame rate. Like a web video usually moves at 30 frames per second. So if you animate something at 30 frames per second, which is to say you make a new animation frame for every single frame of video, there's a new frame of animation. That's called animating on ones. And that is the smoothest animation you can possibly do, right? That's as smooth as it can look within the confines of the video format. If you don't want to do that, because that is incredibly expensive and incredibly work-intensive, you animate on twos, which is to say you animate on every other frame of animation. And if you want to save even more time and money, you animate on 3s. And each different style of animation, each different frame rate of animation has its own properties of movement, has its own properties of aesthetic. They all give kind of a different feeling to the movements that are happening. And that can be a very useful property in animation to exploit to create different feelings, which especially this footage that we're looking at right now shows off. And that's something that's used a lot in the effects work in fighting games, is using like these different variable frame rates for different elements in the effects that are put on screen in order to give a different sense of smoothness, a different sense of movement, a different movement aesthetic. Like everything that the Guilty Gear Arc system, everything that Arc System Works puts out does this a hell of a lot, and what we have right here with this bit especially is a perfect working demonstration of that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to count out the frames as they advance, and this is 60 frames per second footage, so it's going to take a while, and what I want you to do is pay attention to when each element moves, like how many frames pass before each element on screen moves, and how many frames pass for the different elements on screen, and how does that change the aesthetic with which they move. So 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4. Right. So that was probably a little distracting to listen to, but you see how not everything on screen moves on the same frames, right? You can see how the flame over here on the left, which has a very different movement aesthetic, moves at a much slower rate than the flame over here on the right, and it moves much less smoothly. And that's those different animation frame rates giving those animations different aesthetics. Let's play this back at full speed. Right? And you can see how, especially, like, how the full speed especially gives this, how that has a much more sort of chaotic, sort of popping feeling, like sort of like it's sputtering or spitting out bits of smoke. It has a much more sort of frantic energy. Whereas the flame over here, which is animated at much slower frame rate, has much more of a sort of languid, slow, like this is like a thing that's just quietly burning away kind of thing. And that's what you can do with those differential frame rates. By using the right frame rate for the motion that you want to create, you can create those different feelings. And that is something that 2D and 3D animation both exploit very heavily nowadays. Like, there's lots of 3D animation that intentionally, even though you could tell the computer to render everything at 240 frames per second if you wanted to, that would take a long time to render out. But even though you could do that, a lot of the time, even 3D animation will choose intentionally to lower the frame rate at which certain things move, because it just gives the thing a certain movement aesthetic. It also depends on the overall aesthetic of the thing, but you get the point. Anyway, moving on to Illaoi. And there are some interesting changes to Illaoi done specifically for Project L. And one of the best ways, I think, to see the change that has happened to her is perhaps to compare her to her original League of Legends splash art. Let's just zoom in on that a little bit more. So the main thing I want you to see in Illaoi's original splash art, and it is very old, like this is a previous time in League of Legends aesthetic, it has shifted somewhat over the years, but take a look at how much softer everything about this Illaoi is. Like, she's still jacked as hell, make no mistake, but look at how much rounder her head is, look at how much more rounded and soft the curves on her muscles is, look at, like, comparatively how much thicker her body seems to be, compared with the relatively leaner, sharper, especially like around the muscles here. Like, look at the arms, especially how much sharper all the lines on her are, how much sharper the lines on her face are as well. Her hair has also been puffed up very substantially. Like, Illaoi has big hair in her original version also, but here it has been really sort of puffed up to be like a wild mane that comes out of her head in that way. Whereas the thickness of her earrings, for example, has been de-emphasized a little bit. So there's some changes in the shape, language, and anatomy of Illaoi here. Not all of that translates one-to-one into the actual, the actual model on screen, of course. On screen, she is definitely somewhat softer than she is in the concept art, but one change I want you to notice, which is quite substantial, is the size of the head. And once again, I'm going to bring in Illaoi's original splash art here to compare with, if I can just get Thing to cooperate with me. There we go. Look at the size of Illaoi's head. relative to her body here, right? Compare that to the size of her head relative to the body here. This is a very small head in comparison to a really large torso. And that is a change in her proportionality that is an interesting... This is a little interesting visual trick that artists love to use. You'll see it everywhere once you're paying attention to it. But anytime you see a huge, hulking, very beefy, muscular character, pay attention to the size of the head relative to the proportions of the rest of the body, because something artists love to do is make the head smaller in order to make the rest of the body appear bigger and bulkier and more beefy. And you can even see it here in her gameplay footage here. Like, you can see that her head is pretty darn small compared to the sheer hugeness of the body, and it gives her that bigger, more muscular, more hulking shape language. And comparing it over again to her in-game League of Legends model, too, you can see that this Illaoi is definitely rounder. She's definitely a little bit more proportional in the way that she's put together. Her head is definitely bigger relative to her body. And that's partly because League of Legends itself and Project L have very different character design needs from the characters that they create, right? Like, this character is meant to be seen like this, right? Like, she's meant to be seen from this perspective. So if you made her head too small, you know, it would essentially kind of disappear. So there is some fuckery with the proportions that kind of has to happen in League of Legends to make the characters look good there. For example, you probably couldn't make Illaoi's hair quite as big as it is in Project L in League of Legends because it would dominate the silhouette of her model too much. It would change the way that she looks on the field too much and sort of make her character design less clear in the context of League of Legends. You can also see that her character model, and again, admittedly, Illaoi is one of the older champions nowadays. Like, she's from, what, 2009? Something like that? No, not 2009. She's from 2013. I think off the top of my head, I can't remember. She's an older champion. So, like, the textures and, like, the detail on the model is obviously a lot lower, but there's also just a much less detail in her general character design, as we saw when we looked at her concept art. It is just generally a less detail-heavy character design. You can see a lot of it has been retained into the Project L model, but they've added the detail, like with these complicated rope assemblages on her feet, and like with these like weird ropes around her knees. I don't know why she has those. Do those do anything? But she essentially that detail has been added to her. She has a gauntlet or a bracer on the right side of her hand, as well as a glove with that like red and gold color combination that stands out like really strongly, and like there's a really strong contrast. Her idol has been buffed up and made a lot more bright and colorful and saturated. And now partly this is like these models have not finished their texturing yet. I can pretty much guarantee you that they have not received their final textures yet. They're probably more saturated and a little bit more colorful than they probably will be in the final game. There might be some lighting effects that haven't been baked into the textures or even rendered onto the character models by the engine yet. So again, not a final Illaoi, but you can see like where some of the detail and some of the aesthetic has been changed, and especially in the way that her muscles are rendered. Like when you look at the original Illaoi's muscles, which are sort of fairly simple, like you have the God, I used to learn this in an anatomy class, but I've forgotten everything about it. Like the biceps and the fucking muscle bit there, leading into like this big round muscle here with like some small muscles attached. Over here, though, carved and sculpted out of the hardest marble and flint, like just absolutely motherfucking bodybuilder jacked over here, which serves the purposes of Project L more. It's a game that has a sharper, more stylized aesthetic than the main League of Legends game has, and it really wants Illaoi to look like the big, powerful, physical, sort of mid-range, oppressive bruiser that she is. Compare and contrast her anatomy here with the stick-thin, spindly arms of Jinx, for example, because her power, of course, is all in, like, embedded in her weapons as a character design, the way that she's supposed to work in the game. And this general style of changing the character design of the original characters carries over into the rest of Project L as well, which means we should probably talk now about Jinx. And Jinx is a lot more faithful to her League of Legends incarnation than Illaoi is. There hasn't really been any major changes made to her design. There haven't been a lot of details added or taken away. There haven't really been much of an update or a refresh. This is Jinx pretty much as you know her in League of Legends, except for one substantial change. In League of Legends, Jinx wears this bullet belt bikini sort of arrangement on her top. That has been replaced in Project L with this sporty little number, like much more covering sort of tight-sitting sporty top arrangement kind of thing. Now, she does wear something similar in Arcane, but I don't think this change was made to align her character design with Arcane because, well, if they wanted to align her with Arcane, they would have done that, and Jinx looks very different in Arcane than she does here. And also, I would imagine that when Project L launches, an Arcane skin for Jinx and Echo and any other Zaun-like characters that appear will be one of the first things they add as a purchasable cosmetic to the game. So no, I think the culprit here for why that change was made is much more obvious. I think it's just censorship. And that's always a little bit silly, but Riot, especially with their free-to-play offerings, have been a lot more cognizant in recent years about being careful of censorship, especially in like, I believe in the Chinese market, but in multiple foreign markets, and the censorship that app platforms often do to the content that you are allowed to market, especially towards children. And so having a character running around in a bullet bikini, even though, like, in fighting games there is a long tradition for character designs that are substantially more horny than this, because Riot wants this to be a free-to-play game accessible to children, I suspect that is why that particular change was made to the character design, to change her away from the way that she looks in League of Legends, which, yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a big deal. Personally, I think it's just a change that's probably necessary for some boring business reasons, but, you know, it is what it is. So let's start talking about some of the animation and the visuals. And the first thing I want you to notice, though, is what's missing when you look at these two characters in this particular environment. I want you to look at, don't take this out of context, I want you to look at their feet. Specifically, they don't seem to have shadows. Now, it's not entirely true. There are shadows rendered on the characters sometimes, but as you can see, when they're standing on the ground, there really is no shadow on the environment under their feet, which sort of gives them the impression that they're just kind of floating there. The other thing is, they're currently standing in shadow, right? Like, if you look here, you can see the edge of light and shadow falling across the battlefield, and these two characters are currently standing in the shade, but both of them are perfectly lit as though they weren't standing in any shade at all. This is just stuff that's unfinished. Like, I am like 99.9% sure that's just stuff that's unfinished. They're going to have shadows in the final game. They are going to probably be reactive to the lighting in the environment a little bit more in the final game, or they'll just remove the shadows from this particular stage so that they don't have to deal with that. But the effect of that is that both characters seem to be sort of awkwardly floating on top of the background rather than actually be part of the environment, which is one of those fun little unfinished details that you notice when you slow down and take a look. Anyway, the actual animation. So again, remember that Illaoi's animations are definitely unfinished, and they're definitely not showing off all of it, and that these transitions, for example, you can see how that is a slightly awkward shift from one pose to the other. You can see how her feet all of a sudden start clipping through the ground. All of this is just because the thing is unfinished. But the way that this move seems to be and also her hair clips directly through her idol, which is because the hair has physics on it. You can see that happening as Illaoi swings her idol. When it connects, there's hit stop, which is an animation technique that's used to sort of communicate the power of a hit. Is you just stop both characters so that Jinx can kind of wobble back and forth here while she's taking the hit, which sort of emphasizes the damage. But as you can also see, Illaoi's entire model freezes almost completely, except for the physics objects that are attached to her, like, for example, the loincloth, like the little ropes around her waist, and indeed, like her hair, which seems to just keep being affected by whatever physics simulation it's running, a little bit weirdly and inconsistently. Again, this is unpolished, as it falls out of her as the characters get knocked around. And for Illaoi especially, I really love the use of smearing and smear frames. Like, you can see the effects smear begins even before she's actually done her swing. Like, right as she's about to begin the swing, here comes the effects smear, and then that sort of guides the idol in the curve that it's about to take. You can see the curve that it's being, like, swung this way around, being guided by those animation smears as the tentacles, like, really begin to stretch out behind it. And then as it hits and moves into the next phase, see how the tentacles are used to trace the curve of Illaoi's swing, like fully trace the curve of how she's swinging that idol around as the tentacles then deliver the secondary hit of the thing. And that curve is aided by the 2D effects animation that is painted over top of them, like using the same complementary colors, or not just colors, complementary, but almost identical colors to the colors of the tentacles themselves, to really emphasize that thing and sort of emphasize the swing and the curve of it as it goes around, and then how Illaoi completes the curve of that hit, bonk, by swinging it around back to the back of her head, getting her back into her ready position. Like, there's a lot of really scuffed animation, like really just keyframe to keyframe posing happening here, which makes her movement, especially the smaller movements that aren't like the really big movements here, I would say are, I mean, not necessarily complete and polished. Like, you can, for example, see how her upper body kind of jiggles. They're not complete and polished, but like the outline of the motions, the keyframes, are definitely pretty damn complete on this particular move, which again, we have no guarantee that that move will make it into the final game, but if it did, I would imagine that it would, in the broad strokes, look a lot like it does here. The keyframes are finished, but all the in-between stuff, all the polish, all the extras that need to be added on in order to make it look really smooth and good, those have are probably yet to be even remotely finalized. And you can kind of see that in the way that Illaoi settles back into her ready pose here. Is like she just kind of moves very sort of stiffly and robotically into the thing. And what I would be looking for in the finished animation is I would be looking for like secondary movement. I would be looking for like a sort of asynchronous settling of her various, like the various bits of her model and her muscles sort of settling into the ready position instead of merely sort of mechanically slotting into the ready position like that. But I really can't emphasize enough, like, just the excellent use of the tentacles and the smearing to really show. And I also like just the posing is so strong here, like, because like the in-betweens are not done, but if you look at the keyframes like this as a starting point for swinging the idol around, like look at that like S curve moving all the way down. Like, you look at how he's using like the broad sort of Dorito shape of her huge muscular upper body in sort of contrast, creating this hourglass shape with her lower body that creates this tension, which then boom falls into the hit, which is delivered like with that foot forward, like really stepping into it. And you can see how she's pivoting around the heel as she's turning to bring this thing around. Bang. And then out into, let's see if we can catch her as the animations, yeah, the effects animation vanishes, out into the finishing of the thing, where again you can see that leg forward, the whole body leaning into the swing of the thing, and like the back foot still propelling her forwards as she steps forward into her landing position. Like, that's just, ooh, like again, scuffed in-betweens, but the outlines of this animation, like the power, like the full commitment to a huge swing that she does like this. And this also comports with Illaoi's personality, right? Like, Illaoi as a character is someone who's like, always give 100% to everything. Like, never give less than 100% to anything you do. Just full steam ahead, full motion, full change, full charge, full confidence at all times, no matter what we're doing. And that is the kind of movement aesthetic I would expect from that kind of character. Another thing you might notice that isn't done at all on these characters is the facial animation. I believe, I wouldn't be surprised if they haven't even rigged the faces for animation yet, because especially Jinx, she has this expression here for her ready pose, but at all other times, if you look at her, even when she's taken a huge hit to the face with a giant idol, as she recoils, just like neutral face expression, just normal face expression until whoop, just swaps into the sort of smiley ready face. And again, same thing with Illaoi, no change in her expression whatsoever, which is the thing that sort of doesn't match her personality. What I would expect from the finished product is that Illaoi will have some faces that like express passion, that express anger, that express like full engagement with what she's doing, rather than just this sort of neutral blank stare. The other thing, and this is really hard to see in this footage, but the other thing is also that their eyes have no tracking, so they don't really look at each other even in their ready position. They just sort of look vaguely in one another's direction, because none of that stuff is done yet. But like, I really, like, they said that Illaoi is only about 30% finished right now, and I fully believe them, but I really like the aesthetic of her movement, like the way that she's made to move and attack, because she's again, like, with this again, here, we're beginning an attack movement, and you can see how the upper body is used exactly the same way, that huge wedge Dorito shape right there, leading into, like, the narrow waist with the legs, and that forward propulsion and that motion as she leans in, and here comes the other key pose, like, wha-bam! Massive uppercut, which is undercut massively by the lack of expression, but nonetheless, like, massive uppercut, lots of clipping on the model as well. Smacking Jinx, and then settling back into ready position once more. And again, keyframes. Starting from down here, leaning into, like, here comes the swing, right? Like, again, hell of a good key pose right there. We can really see that she's lifting her entire body up. But we get into, like, this huge, like, she's bringing her leg up, she's about to stomp it down, and as she stomps it down, she pulls, right? You can see it's not that she's swinging it, like, you can see how that thing kind of just stays put in the air as Illaoi's entire body comes down, and then when she touches down, she pulls, she heaves that thing forward, she pulls it in that huge arc, once again emphasized by the curve of the tentacles as they're following behind. That huge arc down, smack with the idol, secondary hit from the tentacles. And then, like, as she pulls it back like that, woof, with a third hit coming from the tentacles as they retreat into that thing. And as she's pulling it back too, like, you can see how she's really leaning every part of her body, just, like, dragging. She's not just, like, lifting this thing up easily, she's dragging it along the ground, getting that momentum going, and then swinging it back up over her shoulder like that to settle it back into ready position once more. And here we can also talk about some effects animation. So look at the smoke clouds coming out. We have two distinct sets of smoke clouds happening here. We have this smoke cloud here, the green one, which is associated with Illaoi, and that's a smoke cloud that's generated by the smash of her attack, right? And then we have another smoke cloud, which is an environmental smoke cloud. Like, that's the dust and smoke that's being kicked up by Jinx as she lands in the dirt on the battlefield, right? And those two smoke clouds are really distinct from one another, right? Like, you can see it not just in the color, but in that the smoke cloud from Illaoi's attack effect is completely sharp, right? Like, it has completely sharp outlines, it's very clear, it's very readable, whereas the smoke cloud coming from the environment is all fuzzy around the edges and kind of soft and blurred. So sort of take less visual precedence. And something interesting happens, though. You can kind of see how this smoke here, as Illaoi begins to step back, you can see how the smoke follows her. So I think the smoke here is also tethered to her actual animation model, which is something that they might not do in the final game. I think it makes more sense that the smoke cloud stays where it's generated on the ground rather than being dragged and pulled along with the model sort of tethered to it. Which, who knows how they're going to handle that one. It might make more sense. Like, this is something I don't actually know from the animation perspective of a fighting game. It might actually make more sense to have that, like, the smoke effect of a character's attack tied to the way that they themselves move. We'll talk about Jinx's animations as well, but here again you can see complete expressionlessness as she gets punched in the face, or elbowed, rather. And even this, like, this is presumably one of Illaoi's light jabs, right? Like, one of her quick attacks. Even this, you can see how much like, that big upper body, that torso, the way that it contorts, the way that it twists, is being used to really sell the power of emotions. You can see how she steps into it, like, leaning all of her weight forward on that forward leg as she smacks the elbow in. Transitions that, like, she uses that as a pivot point, so you can see she transfers her weight down into that leg, pushes forward on it, and then brings the knee up as she delivers, like, this whoom, big ass sort of frontal step kick to Jinx's face. And then there's a very awkward transition as the model just kind of swaps into place for boom, headbutt, which again, notice how much they're using, like, Illaoi, like, steps forward. She steps into everything she does. She takes a stride forward with every attack. I love that. Here again, giant Dorito back shape, heaving, pulling the thing. And that's the other thing, like, they're really emphasizing the weight of her idol here, right? She's not just swinging that thing around one-handed like it's not a care in the world, like it's the world's lightest little dagger or whatever. This thing has a huge amount of weight, and she needs to put effort into moving it in any direction whatsoever. Again, emphasizing the curvature with those smear effects. And then a very awkward jumping animation, transitioning into her air attack, which you can really see the curve here, right? Like the huge curve, like that propagates throughout her entire body as she gets ready to swing this thing forward and bring it down and around. And as she lands in that next key pose, the way that she then goes from like a curve that goes this way to a curve that goes that way, right? Like she transitions from curve to curve, and that's part of what gives that animation like so much of its huge swing. The transitions are awkward though. Like this is pretty this is kind of weird for a jumping pose. You can really tell that like this is definitely no more than 30% done. They weren't lying about that at all. But what's here? Like the key poses that are being outlined, like the key approach to the animation aesthetic of this character. Oh, I really love it. I really like the way that they're animating Illaoi so far, and I so look forward to seeing what she looks like once she's been fully polished up. Which leads us on to dear Darius, the hand of Noxus himself. And here, oh boy, there has actually been a substantial aesthetic and character design change made to this character. Now, once again, I'll remind you, the model isn't finished, the texturing isn't finished, the design might not actually be final, so I don't want to jump to too many conclusions right here, but this looks to me like an aesthetic decision to change Darius, specifically, I think by aging him down, and by quite a bit, to be honest. Darius in League of Legends right now looks like this. This is the base character design for this man. He looks somewhere in like the 35 to maybe looking really good for his 50s range, and he's meant to be that way. Darius in League of Legends is meant to be this veteran warrior who's been everywhere, who has seen every battlefield, who's like fought in every single campaign that Noxus has fought since Swain took over, and even before that. A very experienced soldier, an old hand on the battlefield. He's meant to be older, experienced, more mature in his expression, and this Darius, boy howdy, really doesn't look like this. And this isn't something like where you could say, oh well, this Darius is a really old version of the character and maybe they've updated him in recent years, because no, even in the most recent animated short where he appeared, which is this Tales from Runeterra, this looks like a substantially older man to me than this guy does. He's been sort of Garen-ified a little bit here, I feel, and I don't know why they would do this. Like, again, maybe this is just a temporary model, maybe he'll be changed for the final game, but I would disagree personally pretty heavily with this direction for him, because being this particular kind of sexy, young, handsome man just isn't who the character of Darius is. This is where also I'll bring up my weird, insane crackpot theory, because Darius isn't the only character whose age has been changed for Project L. Echo as well, who's getting his ass handed to him pretty definitively in this footage. Echo also has been changed in age. Specifically, he's been aged up. He looks substantially older than he does in, for example, Legends of Runeterra or the base League of Legends game. He looks like he's somewhere in his early to mid-20s, whereas in League of Legends and in Legends of Runeterra, he's like 14, 15, 16, like somewhere in the young teenager range, depending on which depiction exactly you're looking at. So my crackpot theory, my weird, insane person, crazy guy with conspiracy board theory, is that the story of Project L is going to involve some kind of weird time travel. Like maybe the summoners are back. Maybe the summoners are summoning the greatest heroes from all of Runeterra or whatever at the prime of their lives, like when they're youngest and strongest and fittest, but maybe not necessarily the most experienced. Maybe that's why Darius is young. Maybe that's why Echo is older. Maybe that's the direction that they're going with the story of this game. If that's what it turned out to be, hey, just claiming right now that I called it. But it is weird. Like, it is a weird aesthetic decision to make with Darius specifically, because I know also for the people who love Darius, who are really fans of him, who really engage deeply with the character and love him, the fact that he is older is kind of an important thing to them. The fact that he is this older, experienced, mature warrior is an important part of his character, and so why make this aesthetic change just to make him prettier for Project L? The other way in which I don't understand it is like, it's not like Darius, like, it's not like his looks are a huge major selling point for the character. He's not like Ahri or whatever. When he's just standing around on the battlefield, you're not really paying attention to whether or not he looks pretty. are you? Like, the major design features of him are the huge pauldrons, the giant axe, and the red cloak that follows his movements around. It's not really, even from the perspective of, okay, we want Darius to be like an ikemen, like a handsome guy character. Like, no, that doesn't really seem to be the selling point from a character design perspective when you look at this character most of the time. So I am baffled by that decision. I don't know why they did it, unless there is some kind of weird story thing with time travel and summoning people from across time and space or whatever. Zillion broke the time stream continuum, and now everyone's fighting to oh shit, that actually might be it. It might be that Zillion broke time, and now the fighters like fighting over trying to repair the time stream. Maybe that'll be the story. Who knows? Anyway, moving on from that, let's talk about his animation. Now, remember with Illaoi, how we talked about she likes to step forward into her opponent. Like, she likes to take these strides. She likes to have this forward momentum with her, which comports with her character because that's what her religion is all about, this forward momentum, constant forward movement. Darius is someone who you would kind of imagine might have that same movement aesthetic, right? Like, he's a big juggernaut warrior who like strides forward and dominates the battlefield. You'd imagine that they would do that, but no, Project L, at least currently, is doing something much more interesting with him. Pay attention to how Darius attacks when he does the big swings with his axe, because he does not actually step forwards. He does something else that's quite interesting. And remember also how we talked about, like, Darius, his whole thing is that he is a sort of powerful, dangerous veteran fighter on the battlefield, right? Like, so he's someone who very much isn't reckless. In the stories that we have about him when he's leading his men, he is being careful with them. Like, he's not just jumping head first into the first fight that becomes available to him. He's careful. He baits the enemy out. He uses squad tactics. He's a good commander and a general. He doesn't make reckless movements. When he does move, he moves with power and purpose, and he absolutely decimates people, but he doesn't go until he's certain that it's a good move to make. And so look at the way that he's leaning into. He's about to like swing his axe up and smack Echo into the ground. Look at how he does that. He doesn't step forwards to increase the axe's range. He leans backwards, away. He has this defensive position, protecting himself with the shoulder over there as he's like charging up or like winding up to swing the axe. And then you can see how he pivots his weight forward. He doesn't step anywhere. Like, the leg is already there. He doesn't need to step into it. The leg is already there. All he does is pivot his weight from one leg over to the other, and then the axe comes up. He grabs it by the little circular handle down there, gets a hold of Echo, and then brings the other hand in, and then he finally steps forward. Like, then you can sort of see he brings the other leg forward, but even now, he's still leaning backwards, pulls Echo down, boom. And now see, again, as he gets ready for his next big swing, again, he's leaning away. He's bringing the shoulder up. He's guarding himself as he's winding up the axe. And then finally, once he's ready, that's when he pushes forward. Comes in with the axe hit. And even notice that he's not stepping forward. He's keeping his center of gravity where it is. He's just leaning it in different ways, pivoting on one leg, and then letting the other leg follow the axe as it comes around. And then as he rotates, like, once again, you can see how he's using the big shoulders. He's leaning away from the enemy. He's not leaning forwards. He's not moving forwards. His entire body posture is like leaning away from the danger in order to protect himself and create an opening for his attack to hit. And that's something that's, at least in the versions of the animations that we have right now, it's pretty consistent. Even here, you can see as the axe is being swung forward, Darius is leaning away rather than leaning forward, which is a very different kind of movement than Illaoi has. It's no less powerful, but it is like a very different approach to how he uses his body to do his attacks. Like, very much his movements and his attack animations are centered around the movement of the axe. It's all about winding up those big swings and then letting the axe carry the momentum forward and using like the maximum range of what the axe can do as well. And then we get the little super cutscene here, which is like, we get sort of a standard, like with the speed lines and everything, sort of impact frame when he's sort of charging up, and you can see like the axe gets this little blinky thing that happens on it. And then we get into the key poses. Like, again, here's a wonderful key pose. This is essentially a baseball swing that he's doing here. You can see how he's pivoting around the foot here with this, like, with the other leg following it as it sort of propels him forward. And you can see how much work the effects animation is really doing here to sell the axe hit and sell that deadly curve of the swing that he's doing. And you can also see how the entire camera shifts perspective, right? We're fully in a Dutch angle here, which is to say, like, the horizon line in the camera is completely shifted. Because we're not doing gameplay right now, we're just doing a cutscene, so we can shift that angle. And what doing a Dutch angle like this does for an image is it introduces instability, which creates dynamism, it creates motion, it creates a sense of something sudden happening or change occurring or something. Like when the horizon line isn't centered, that usually means you're off kilter, and you're off kilter because something is happening. Now, I really do hope in the final game that they'll let us turn the camera shake down or maybe disable it, because like there's some camera shake in this game that honestly kind of makes me a little bit nauseous to look at, and I really hope that you get the option to maybe get rid of that a little bit, because I find it very disorienting, to be quite honest. Now, the actual swings themselves as he gets into the attack is not finished or polished animation as far as I can tell. He's just kind of rotating around his axis, like the model isn't doing anything. There doesn't seem to be any animation happening. He's just keeping a static pose while he spins around, which is not like, if we sort of rewind and watch it in full motion, it goes by so fast that you don't really notice that. But I would imagine, like with finished animation product, they might put a little bit more polish into that, like give him a little bit of a sense of wind up as he comes around here, as he gets ready to swing the axe again to sort of emphasize the hits. There are things you can do there, but the thing I want to talk about here is the cape, especially because the cape is used all over Darius's animation to emphasize his movements, right? So as he begins to spin, you can see how here, like, the cape has this triangular shape that sort of emphasizes its motion as it's rotating and spinning around his body. You can see it here, like much like the effects animation are doing for the axe. The cape's rotation is doing the same kind of thing for Darius. It's emphasizing the spin that's happening on his body. You can see this curve right here that's being maintained, sort of mimicking the curve of the spin that's going around his body. Here, especially, you can really see how the curvature of the cape is emphasizing the spin of the character. And that's interesting because the cape is in part a physics object. Like, in part, it seems to be animated by simulated physics sort of moving the fabric around, and then in part, in some places, the animators take full control and actually keyframe animate the cape from position to position to really give it the emphasis on the motion that they want it to have. And you can see here as he comes out of his swing, like as the rotational swings stop, you can see how the cape sort of settles as it like emphasizes the last bit of curvature. The cape settles into the air, changes shape, and now it begins to change to a curve in the opposite direction, which sort of sets up that tension. As you can see, Darius is beginning to spin his body, like he's bringing the leg up. You can see how he's beginning to swivel his hips around in order to set up the rotation for the next movement that happens. And then, bam, here, as the axe actually lands, you can see here the animator has taken control of the cape. They're keyframe animating it, telling it to stay up there, stay in the air, create this vertical downward shape that mimics like the shape of the smear frame to really emphasize like that landing, that hit. And then finally, once all the hits, all like the shaking is beginning to stop, the cape sort of gently sort of just drifts down and settles over Darius to like really emphasize the aftermath moment of like this huge, enormous hit. And then swing the axe up, get back into position, and here something funny happens, something really fun. You see what happens to Darius' character model here? This, I believe, is a model swap between two different animation models. Now, there's multiple reasons why this might happen. It might be that they have a separate, distinct character model for the cutscene when he does his super attack, because for whatever reason, like this model here is a little bit better than that model there for what they want his character model to do in the cutscene. It could also be that one of these two is a more current model, like a current revision of the model that has been changed, which is closer to what it will look like on release. One of these models might just be newer, and the other might be older. If I had to take a guess, I would say that the cutscene model might be the older one, specifically because you can see here how the pauldrons like cover up his face a little bit more. They sort of bulk up and become a little bit more asymmetrical on the top of his body, which is might be something that they wanted to tone down, open up his face a little bit more, and like emphasize the knees in a different way with like these bigger, chunkier knee pads that he's got on them. Like, so it might be that this is just the more current model, and this is just a holdover from a previous build where they haven't gotten around to swapping out the model for the cutscene yet. It could also be the other way around, that this one is newer because the cutscene for the super attack was made more recently and they needed a different model for that, and maybe this is closer to what he'll look like on release. Either way, I don't know, but either way, it's cool. Like, that's a really cool little thing to see, that we get to see this little artifact of game development happening. Sort of just a very quick, subtle little model swap. Like, you probably wouldn't really notice it in full motion, I don't think. And for all that I've commented on, like, the scuffed parts of the animation, like, seeing this play out in full motion, like, it does look genuinely glorious, especially in 60 frames per second. I believe this will be the first 60 frames per second video uploaded to my channel, by the way. And I really do like what they've done with Darius. I really do like that decision to make his movement aesthetic so specifically distinct from Illaoi's. Like, the way that he moves in combat is distinct from how Illaoi moves, even though they are two characters who are, superficially at least, very similar in their build and body type. Moving on to Echo, a character who has been changed, quite substantially actually, from his League of Legends incarnation. First of all, of course, he's been aged up. As I mentioned, he's now a young man, somewhere perhaps in his early 20s, rather than being a teenager. Secondarily, the change in hairstyle. This version of Echo inherits the hairstyle that he has in Arcane and in the true damaged skin that seems to be the originating factor for that particular version of his hair. His League of Legends version instead has the, I will say, fairly iconic mohawk. I do miss that a little bit from Echo. I think the new hairstyle is probably better as a character design feature, but the old mohawk does have its charms. It's so loud and ostentatious. It's kind of charming, I think. The other massive major change that's been made to him is just to the outfit that he's wearing. In League of Legends, Echo wears this sort of semi-boiler suit arrangement, like with these really low pants, like that go where the crotch goes all the way down to his knees. He's got this thick leather apron hanging out on the front. He's got this little control thing for his C drive or whatever it is, and he's got a scarf on with his welding goggles attached to them. That is very different from what Echo wears in Project L. He doesn't have, like, the super low crotch pants. They've been slicked down to something that's a bit more sleek, and that's probably meant to work primarily with the way that he animates as a character, which we'll get into later. He also has a completely different outfit on the upper part of his body. He doesn't have his scarf anymore. The welding goggles are gone, and that's, to me, is a little bit of a loss, because the welding goggles on Echo were always part of this thing of, like, he's this kid who lives in a scrap heap and puts together cool inventions just from, like, the random stuff that he finds. That's always been an important part of his character to me, and that's a little bit gone here because he doesn't have the big sort of industrial looking apron on any longer. He doesn't have his welding goggles. He looks a lot less like a scrap heap inventor, and instead they've gone with something that approaches more of a streetwear kind of fashion aesthetic for him, which is cool. Like, it does suit the character, especially the aged up version of him. It makes him look a little more sleek, a little bit more cool, but you lose out on those scrappy inventor vibes that he has in League of Legends proper. His C drive has also gotten quite substantially bigger, actually. Echo's C drive is, like, fairly large, but it's not quite as large compared to his body as the C drive is in Project L. And that makes a certain degree of sense from a gameplay perspective, I suppose, because the C drive, as we shall see when we talk about his gameplay animation, is actually a pretty important part of his character, and you do need to be able to see it at all times, both as Echo and as the player who's playing against him. So yeah, I feel mixed about the changes to Echo. The hairstyle is fine, but, like, there is a loss of some of the sense of his character from League of Legends. Like, there is a loss of that, like, he's the kid who lives in a scrap heap who makes whatever he can out of the stuff that he finds. That part of the character design is gone a little bit and replaced with more of a, this kid is an agile parkour cool guy fighter type sort of character, which is also a part of Echo as a character, but seems to be drawn, at least to me, more from Arcane than it does from League of Legends. So let's talk about Echo's movement and some of the reasons why they had to change his pants, I think. And we'll start on this particular frame right here, because it demonstrates something that's fun and also kind of inevitable about animation. We talked about how, like, Illaoi and Darius have these very different animation and movement aesthetics, and, like, oh, it's so cool that the animators can, like, differentiate the characters by the way that they move. But then also sometimes you run into situations like this one, where Echo and Darius are striking essentially exactly the same pose, because sometimes when a character is running with a weapon in their hand, it just looks a certain way. Like if they're making a certain movement and they're carrying a thing in their hand and you have to have them like leaning forwards into like a dashing forwards run, sometimes that just looks a certain way and it doesn't really matter who the character is. Sometimes you can't necessarily fully uniquely characterize every single movement that every single character makes. Sometimes there's overlap, and that's perfectly fine. But the thing that happens next is the one that's more interesting, because this is clearly my man's gonna Dark Souls. He's doing a dodge roll right through Darius, avoiding his attack, and also placing down his clone on the ground. Keep track of that one for later, because it's going to become important. The arc of the jump that Echo does here is actually quite excellent. Like, look at how he's rising, then his body sort of contracts into this really strong dynamic key pose as he sort of, like, he gets a little bit of coyote time just hovering in the air without being affected by gravity. And then as he starts to come down, you can see how he shifts from having this leg stretched out as he goes up to having the other leg stretched out as he goes down, which is like, it just describes this really gorgeous falling arc of the character. Just like really well composed and well put together little jumping animation right here. And then he does an air dash. Just kind of stops. I don't know if it has a dodge component. It seems like this hurt box should connect with him there. At least that seems reasonable. But maybe it has like invulnerability frames. And then he does this little air hop. Well, like you can see, it's like he's doing parkour over Darius almost. Like you can see like with the hand down there and like swinging his legs up and over that way. It's almost like he's doing parkour over a small wall, but the small wall is Darius, and also it's hovering in the air above Darius's head. And then he does something else, which is cool, which is he activates the ability to go back to his previous state, which then replaces his entire body with this like sort of smeared out backwards leaning, because he's going back in time. You see backwards leaning red silhouette that fades into his position previously. And here's the important thing that happens. See how the Z drive all of a sudden turns pink? Keep that in mind for later, because something's going to happen with that. He lands, and this whole clip sequence is just designed to demonstrate movement. They're not actually trying to fight. And then he does this forward low attack, which is like this sort of reverse front flip, where he uses like the momentum from down here to like really swing his entire body with both legs around. Lands on the ground, and then he does this move where he winds up his Z drive and it turns green again. So presumably what happens here is that Echo has a certain number of charges on his Z drive where he can leave his clones behind and swap into position with them in order to manipulate his movement. And the reason why I think he has charges, like the reason why I think he has more than one, is because he's gonna do it again. You can see he leaves his clone behind and returns to it here. But this time, his Z drive doesn't turn pink. It doesn't seem to have expended all of its charges, which I think is quite curious. So that's a little bit of theorizing from me about some of the game mechanics that Echo has. I suspect he has like a number of charges on it. He has to recharge it every once in a while, like find an opening to do this animation in order to get the charges back, and then he can do the thing that he wants to do again. Here, let's have a look at his attack animation. So once again, like these very strong curves that are being described, but look at the break in the curve as it comes in here. Like we get this like smooth curve over here, and then all of a sudden like it just breaks and slices down like that. And that gives Echo's swings, like compare that to Darius' swings, which are always so wide and so long ranged. Echo's swings have a little bit more of sort of a close range, sort of fast swinging close combat feel to them, the way that their curves are described when he swings his weapon. Here again, that little vault over Darius, and I really like, here we get to see the complete arc of it. You can see how he's kind of leaning into it, swinging one leg over, swinging the other leg over, and landing like so smoothly. Like the arc of this jump animation is just so gorgeous. Like that's just because again, this is the thing about describing a character's movement animation. Jumping over Darius like that, it didn't really need to look like a vault like that, but it does, and it gives him a parkour feel. Like it gives him sort of a scrappy, like he's running through the streets all the time. Even when he's fighting, he's sort of doing parkour through the streets kind of vibe to him. And that comes across again, like in this, again, very unfinished and rather jank, but with strong key poses throw animation he has for his little, I think it's his Q in-game. Where again, like, that's not really a sort of super polished, trained baseball pitching kind of vibe for the way that he's throwing. It's a very unbalanced, kind of awkward, like, whoop, back, and then whoop, like, rotating his entire body forward and, like, even like he's losing his balance here. You can see he has to bring the leg forward to catch himself before he falls over. So it's like a really unbalanced and kind of janky throw, but which again matches the vibe of him. Like he's just this street kid who's like learned to fight on his own, who isn't trained, who isn't disciplined, who isn't like being careful to manage his center of gravity or whatever, which is something that Darius is. Like, we talked about that with Darius, is that he very rarely makes unnecessary movements, right? Like, he very rarely unbalances himself. He very much has his center of gravity under control. Echo, on the other hand, is perfectly happy to get into a really unbalanced position, you know, to get a good throw out of the thing and then just kind of catch himself and like find himself where he is, which I think is like an interesting way to characterize the character. His movement aesthetic matches the environment that he grew up in. And that sort of street kid scrappy feeling to him carries over into his most of his attack animations, really. You can see it here, how like he's leaping over Jinx's attack, and then as he gets ready to actually do his own hit, the way that he kind of winds up, and like you can see the way that he's like flying through the air. This is not really very coordinated, athletic, sort of agile gymnast kind of vibe to him. It's much more scrappy. It's much more ad hoc and impromptu. And the poses that he lands in sometimes are even quite cartoony, like the way that his legs are splayed out this way. But one thing that's interesting about the way that he swings his weapon, you see how the smear frame, like the thing that sort of delineates the curve and the cut of his weapon, is actually shorter than the full length of the bat that he's swinging around. You can see that especially in the attack that he's about to do here. You can see how much shorter that curve is than the actual length of the weapon, and that gives you that sense, that feeling that he's actually swinging this weapon really close to his body. He's not really reaching out super far to try and reach someone at the very edge of it. He's trying to reach someone with the center of the mass of this thing close to his body, which again gives you some, like, it's presumably all about sort of explaining the range of the hurt box on the weapon in a way that people can sort of understand. But again, it also gives Echo that sense of being more of an, like, it's almost as though he's more used to fighting in close quarters, right? It's almost like he's more used to fighting in an alley than on a battlefield. Darius, with his big wide swings, like always using the full, taking advantage of the full range of the axe. And Echo more like, if I swing this thing wildly, I'm just going to collide with like a sewer pipe or something, and I'm not actually going to get the swing. And he has this sense of swinging more closely around himself that I wonder if it's storytelling. I wonder how much of it is storytelling, and I wonder how much of it is meant to be like just communicating the way that his game design works, like the range of the character himself and the movements that he can make. Either way, it's interesting. It gives him a unique, like, aesthetic. Like, again, something that sets him apart from the swings of Darius, for example, is that there is that different sense of range to them. There's different sense of range to his character. And the last little Echo animation I want to draw your attention to, just because I thought it was so freaking funny, is here. He's about to get shot by Jinx's lightning gun. And look at Echo's pose here. Like, this is sheer Looney Tunes. Like, this is pure. I hope, I want, and I'm telling you this right now, Riot animators, I want in the final release of the game, when Echo strikes this pose, I want to have little flash frames where you can see the skeleton inside him when he's being electrocuted like that. I want that. Please do it, because this pose, this pose is like pure Bugs Bunny. This is pure Elmer Fudd getting electrocuted kind of pose with the jiggling and everything. I think that's lovely. I think you should really lean into the silliness of that, because I think that could be quite funny indeed. Speaking of Looney Tunes, let's look at Jinx's animations. Now, once again, her face is obviously not quite fully animated yet. I suspect their head and the movements are not quite fully rigged and animated yet. But this is Jinx's run animation, this silly, cartoony hop and a skip kind of thing, which is like something that's true to Jinx's character very much. But like, wow, what a different aesthetic and feel for a run animation, isn't it? And you can see it too, like in the way, like when Jinx runs in her full dash, look at what happens to her back here. Look how far forward that chest is, how far forward she's pushing that belly. Look at the curve in the upper body. Like, this again is like some real breaking of the character model, really stretching and pressing her a lot further than what is remotely realistic. And it also seems that her stopping animation is like this sort of skidding to a halt Sonic the Hedgehog animation that gets her to like stop where she's going and going to a stand position. And Jinx generally also has more of a goofy vibe to her attack animation. If we wait for a second here, she's going to pull out her hammer and give Echo a big smack. And what I want you to pay attention to with the hammer is, first of all, that it comes out of nowhere. Like, it literally just spawns as tiny and then it grows bigger. But also look how flexible and rubbery this thing is. How it bends and stretches. Which again is like a really cartoony vibe, right? Like this big rubber mallet that she's pulling out of nowhere, out of hammer space, and just smacking him with. And that all sort of informs the jolly, silly comedy vibes of Jinx as a character, that she is a very silly, very wild character. And it's really being undercut by the fact that she has no expression. She, like, you can really see how much the expression, even though it's very small on screen, even though it shouldn't matter, you can kind of see how much it matters that Jinx should have like a gleeful, shouty, grinny, laughing expression on her face here, because otherwise it looks so weird that the rest of her animation aesthetic is so Looney Tunes, but her character right now is just so serious and so unbothered. Anyway, look at Fishbones. As Fishbones gets ready to fire the rocket, it swells up, and then boom, pops like a balloon as it actually fires the projectile out of it. Darius doesn't do this. Like, none of Darius's motions have that kind of wibbly-wobbly, squash and stretch, rubbery cartoon vibe. That's something that's specific to Jinx, and that's presumably something that they're, like, something that I hope that they'll lean into even harder, like to really make Jinx stand out as the funnier, sillier cartoon, I have a million weapons at my disposal and a hammer I can pull out of nowhere sort of Bugs Bunny character. I really hope they lean into that, because that's something that I would foresee becoming really charming and fun about playing her specifically. We'll finish out by talking about Ahri, a character who both does and actually doesn't look quite different from how she looks in-game in League of Legends. Like, in the first order, if you think of Ahri as she looks in Legends of Runeterra, for example, and you look at this character design, you go, oh, well, it's like, it's not really a substantial change there. She has the belt around the waist, she has like the white stripes on the top of her outfit and all that. Yeah, that's pretty much the same character, isn't it? Then you look at her splash art, and it's like, oh, okay, like, actually, the white wings on her arms there, they are completely white here, but they've been turned red there, and like, her dress here looks like it's wrapped much more tightly around her, whereas here it's kind of floppy, and she has those big sleeves that she doesn't have here. Changes and changes, and then you look at how Ahri actually looks in game, and you go, oh, no, wait, this is actually a completely different costume from top to bottom. And yet it is very recognizable as Ahri's iconic costume, right? So, like, it sort of reflects that her in-game character model, which gets a visual update soon, thank the Lord, is actually very old, and the state of League of Legends aesthetic and the state of Ahri's character design has changed a lot since back then. One of the major changes that's made, though, from every single incarnation of Ahri, whether that's her splash art or her Legends of Runeterra incarnation, though, is that in Project L, she has these knee-high boot, sock, legging, whatever they are. She has these things which are very dark, which provides a strong contrast with her tail and with her fairly pale skin. And that's one of those changes that I would say has been introduced primarily as a way to create visual contrast in her character design. That's something that, like, if you remember, in League of Legends, all characters are designed to be viewed from the top down, and so maybe it's not as important that Ahri is, like, wearing white and red boots that sort of just flow together with the top of her outfit, because, like, you're looking at her from the top down, who cares? But when you're looking at her from the side on in a fighting game like this, having that clarity of motion, of knowing where each of her limbs are at all times, can actually be kind of important to the way that you read her animation. And so I suspect that's one of the reasons why they gave her these, like, knee-high dark color surface really on her legs, is to separate out her legs from the rest of the body so that they're identifiable as part of her animation, and especially as part of her attack animation. Like, that's the kind of thing that it might be quite important to keep readable for the players. And I think it's probably the same reason why she doesn't retain her big poofy sort of flowy sleeves anymore, because if she had those big poofy flowy sleeves, that puts a lot of extra pressure on the animation for her arms to be very clear and not getting too muddied and unclear when there's a lot of stuff moving on the screen all the time. Like, I think the animators probably just went, she already has the tail that flows around all over the place, she already has the hair that flows out around all over the place. animated by the physics engine, we don't want to also give her sleeves that need to be animated by the physics engine. That's too much noise. And it also might be a thing about optimization. This is something that hasn't been talked about much with Project L. We don't really know what the specifications are going to be for that game, but Riot in general likes to try and keep their games playable on a toaster, is sort of the meme about them. Like, they really try and keep the processing requirements and the RAM requirements for running one of their games as low as possible. And maybe for a character like Ahri, having both the hair and the nine tails and the sleeves all animated by the physics engine at the same time, maybe that's just a thing they were like, we can optimize that away. It's not a huge loss. We don't really need it for the animation. There could be all kinds of reasons for it. I think it's just animation clarity, but who knows? She also wears a choker now, which I think is a very sexy little detail to add to the character, and that sort of gets at one of the other changes that have been made to her character design, because in the most recent incarnation of Ahri, like the most lore current version of her character, is this. This is how she looks in the Ruined King game. And if you compare the two, first of all, the saturation of the colors, obviously. That's more of an aesthetic thing. Ruined King is a very desaturated game in general. Like, the colors aren't quite as bright. But if you also pay attention to how Ahri just looks in terms of how she's put together, this outfit over here looks sort of very smooth, very coordinated, very even and quite symmetrical across the way that it's put together. Compare and contrast that to the aesthetic of Ahri's dress over here, which is quite chaotic by comparison to this one over here. There's more darker colors introduced to her, and she also has like wild and unkempt, unmanaged hair, as well as these deep dark shadows around her eyes, which, like, yeah, they're eyeshadow and mascara, whatever, but they're also meant to sort of give her a much more intense look. And that's because in the Ruined King game, Ahri's story is that she's losing control of herself. She's losing control of her powers. She has this nature where she likes to feed on people's emotions. She likes it so much, in fact, that she sometimes kills people by feeding on all of their emotions and sucking their souls out of their body, which is, whoopsie doopsie. And she doesn't feel great about that because, she tries to be a good person. And so that pains her a lot. But she's also deeply, deeply addicted to the rush of feeding on people's emotions. And she's worried about that. She goes to the Bilgewater and goes through the Ruined King game, learning to control herself, learning the history of her people, learning how they control themselves, and sort of gaining a better grasp on her powers. But this is sort of an unhinged Ahri as a consequence of that. Like, this is Ahri who's not composed, who's not really in control of herself, who's dangerous, like still sexy, but who's dangerous and kind of unhinged. That is not this Ahri. Like, the Ahri that is in Project L is much more classic Ahri. Like, it's much more the Ahri that you know from League of Legends, the Ahri that you know from KDA, who's the much more popular version of the character, I should say. And that sort of makes me question in terms of, like, if this game has the timeline fuckery, that little crackpot theory I talked about earlier, if this is a thing of, like, the characters are being drawn out from various parts of their history, sort of asynchronous and out of time with each other, then I guess they'll explain it by going, oh, this is Ahri who's like, this is like 20 years after the Ruined King thing happened, and she's fully in control of herself now. She's fully become the glamorous fox girl sorcerer that you all know and love. Don't worry about it. I also think it's a little bit of a pity. Like, I quite liked Ahri in the Ruined King. I quite liked the unhinged, dangerous energy to her. Also because, like, dangerous women are sexy. I'm just saying. I quite liked that part of her character. I quite liked that part of her story, because, like, the idea of her being an energy vampire and, like, being having trouble controlling herself and being, like, sort of unhinged and very frightened of herself because of that, that's been a part of her story for a very, very long time. It's just never been a part of her character design. And so I thought it was cool in the Ruined King game that Ahri got to show that side of herself visually in the design, and it's a little bit of a pity that it's not here anymore. But I also recognize that glamorous, sexy fox girl Ahri who, like, floats around gracefully on the battlefield and charms everyone with her spells and stuff, that's the more popular version of the character. Like, when people want to play Ahri in a fighting game, that's probably the version of her that they want to play. So I recognize that I'm in the minority, but I do think it's a bit of a pity that we don't get to see Ruined King Ahri in this Project L fighting game. Maybe that could be a skin, though. The tension, though, between feral, animalistic Ahri and beautiful, glamorous Ahri is a little bit on display in her animation, I think. It's not huge, it's not a substantial part of her character design, but there is something about the way that Ahri carries herself that I think is worth paying attention to and noticing. So if you look at the way that she holds her hands, pretty much all of the time, she always has either her fingers spread out like this, or she keeps her hand in like a sort of claw-like shape. Pretty much in all of the poses that she does. You can see it here in this Bayonetta spiral dive that she does as well, that she has the fingers all spread out like that, as though she's treating her fingers like claws. And it's also something like, just in terms of like this as an animation, the way that she literally dives at Darius physically, bodily, face first, essentially, or dives past him in this instance, with her movement abilities. There are aspects of the way that she moves as a character that sort of imply a little bit more of that wild feral nature, but then there's other parts of her character that just fully go, no, Ahri is the glamour queen. Like, she's the gorgeous, she's gorgeous, she is the moment, she's giving the whatever. I'm not 100% up on my modern slang. Like, with these really strong S curves, like where she's really like emphasizing her hips, really emphasizing like the curve in her back. In her walk animation, for example, which is just fully a strut, or just the way that she stands, which like is a very sort of posed, very poised kind of vibe in the way that she moves. And you can also kind of see it in animations like this one, like this, in terms of like dashing backwards, like the way that she holds her hand out, like that little dainty pointy forward thing there. It's very poised and managed and very specific. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, because like there are parts of her, like the way that she attacks here, for example, we can see she really kind of swipes with her hand as though she's swiping with a claw, like more than being a slap or a punch or a slash. And the way that she like spins in the air, that implies a little bit more of that animalistic nature. So in the specifics of her animation, I think there is some aspect of that part of her character being implied, and that tension between the wild and the feral and the poised, perfect, you know, KDA supermodel that she otherwise likes to be. So, looking at some of her actual attack animations, it seems to me that the idea here is that Ahri is less fighting with her body and always fighting with her powers, right? So when she attacks here, for example, one of the orbs that's, and these are very, very unfinished, one of the orbs that are floating behind her briefly disappears, and it reappears around here. You can see it just kind of pops back into existence. And I wonder if the idea of the character, you can see it here also, how like that one just kind of vanishes. And I wonder if the idea is that Ahri, when she's actually fully finished, when her animation is actually done, that she'll be fighting by throwing around her Foxfire orbs, or whether those orbs were generated by one of her abilities and can sort of be triggered as an attack. Who knows? But it seems the idea of the way that she moves, the way that she animates, is that she's not really attacking physically, she's always attacking using her magic specifically, which is then channeled through these movements that she has. And something else you can note about the way that Ahri moves and the way that Ahri attacks is that she too has a very different vibe than either Illaoi or Echo or Jinx or indeed Darius, in that, like Darius, when he attacks, he's always very planted, he's always very strong in the way that he's put down. Here, Ahri, this is not really a very stable pose for her. Frankly, you could push her over with a stiff breeze, but it's gorgeous. Like, again, emphasizing those curvatures, emphasizing just how gorgeous the S-curve in her body is. Same thing here, as she's spinning around almost like a dancer for this particular move. Like, especially here, you can really see just how heavy, like, the curvature of her spine, how tiny her waist is. All about just emphasizing, like, the classical beauty of Ahri, the glamour of the way that she's put together. The same thing goes here. Like, this is very much a pose that's much more about that than about communicating power. It's not a martial arts pose, right? Like, it's not a pose that you'd take if you were, like, attacking someone with karate or with kung fu. This is all sort of glam and dance moves, essentially. Here we get a little bit of a look, not much of a look, at her walk cycle, which, again, just has fully that runway model strut thing going on, which is interesting because, like, if Misfortune was ever added to the game, I would think that that would be one of the very identifying parts. Like, I'd be curious how, if Misfortune is added to the game, like, how would they make her strutting different? Like, how would they make her, like, expressions of glamour and sexuality different than someone like Ahri? Because if they can't do that, that would kind of bother me a little bit. Like, that would kind of suck, because there is more than one way to be hot and sexy and be a sexy fighting girl in terms of the way that you're animated. And again, with those strong key poses, like, that's something that's so important to fighting games as well, to have those strong key poses, like, especially here, because you can see the hit stop that happens, right? Like, when you hit someone with an attack, both character models freeze in place, even though the physics simulation keeps going. And in order to make that look decent, you do have to have really strong poses at the moment of the hit for each of them, because otherwise they just look kind of bad and awkward when they're frozen in place by the hit stop animation. And of course, in full motion, not that you're going to notice it that much, but it still is one of those things that if it's not executed well, you won't necessarily see it, but your brain will feel it. Anyway, I think I have gone on for long enough now. Let's call the video here. I'm really excited for Project L as a visual project, if nothing else. Like, even though the animations here, I've talked about how they are very unfinished, most of them, the broad strokes of what's here genuinely looks fantastically good, and I can't wait to see get my my grubby little hands on a full compilation of all the cutscenes for the super animations, so I can take a look at them, because in some aspects of the way that the characters are animated, they express so much about their personality and their character that would be really interesting to take a deeper look at. And in terms of the story, insofar as the game's going to have one, I believe we have had confirmed that it's going to have one. I'm very curious what the hell that's going to be, like how they're gonna fighting game story justify the characters being so, being different from the way that they are in game and also being very similar to it. I wonder if we're going to get that time travel nonsense that I've speculated about. But this video is long enough. I have blabbered on in an unstructured manner for a substantial period of time, which I now have to try and do a little bit of mild editing on, and hopefully it'll turn out to be watchable. Yeah. So I'm gonna end the video now. Hey, thank you very much for watching. This was a bit of an old school TV's Guy video, just sitting down and talking about some stuff I'm pulling up on my screen as I'm doing it. That's how I used to make all my videos, and back then I could put out several videos in a single week. Nowadays I've started insisting on writing scripts and doing editing, and now it takes me weeks to finish even one video. I do kind of miss the old days in that way. Anyway, if you've enjoyed this video, I would very much appreciate it if you gave it a like, subscribe to the channel, or maybe left a comment. That stuff all helps out in the YouTube numbers algorithm nonsense that I have to care about because it's my job. If you want to support the channel more directly, well, I have a Patreon for that there's some rewards over there, or you can subscribe to my Twitch channel if that's more your speed. I'm playing through God of War Ragnarok over there right now and analyzing the game and telling stories from Norse mythology while I play. It is, after all, my mythology, and people seem to have a good time watching it, so hey, maybe that's something you'd be into? I also have a Let's Play channel where the Twitch VODs go up on, among other things, and over there I try to provide story and art analysis of the games I play. I upload new shorts daily over on my Shorts channel, if that's more your speed, and links to all of that are in the description if you want to check it out. But if you don't want to do any of that, honestly, you don't have to. It is more than enough that you have watched the video this far. And hey, if you did watch the video this far, put quarter circle punch emojis in the comments and I'll leave a little heart on them. Or hell, actually, put any input, your favorite move from a fighting game. Just put the input in the comments, use numpad notation if you can't do it with emojis, and let's see if we can't confuse some people. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Remember to be kind to one another, have solidarity with those who are worse off than yourselves, and may the tides of history wash gently over us all.